Hello, I'm Hope Logan. I am an actor on Bold and the Beautiful, and many people really love both me and our Bold and the Beautiful drama. So I've come here to share updates about my beloved Bold and the Beautiful. Everyone, please subscribe and support me. If you do, I will keep coming every day with new updates for you. The battle for power inside the Bold and the Beautiful was already simmering beneath the surface. But now, the tension inside Forrester Creations was beginning to feel like a full-scale war waiting to explode. What started as quiet frustration over hope for the future had suddenly transformed into a dangerous and deeply personal struggle for control, loyalty, and legacy. At the center of it all stood Steffy Forrester, refusing to bend even an inch as pressure closed in around her from every direction. She could already sense the manipulation moving behind the scenes long before anyone dared say it out loud. The moment Ridge hesitated, the moment Brooke started acting certain the job would soon be hers, Steffy saw the truth clearly forming in front of her eyes. Someone had pushed this into motion, and deep down, she already knew exactly who it was. Hope Logan had lit the match, and now the entire Forrester empire was threatening to burn around them. Ridge walked into the confrontation looking like a man already defeated before the conversation even began. He barely had the courage to say the words, standing there awkwardly while Steffy practically pieced together the situation herself from the guilty expression written all over his face. The silence between them felt heavier than any argument could have. Ridge tried to soften the blow by explaining Brooke's reasoning, desperately leaning into the fantasy that he and Brooke were somehow the next version of Stephanie and Eric, destined to lead together as fashion royalty. But Steffy rejected the idea immediately, almost insulted by the comparison. To her, this wasn't about destiny or romance or some grand family legacy. This was about power, and she could smell manipulation all over it. While Brooke sat comfortably convinced that Ridge would pressure Steffy into surrendering her position, Steffy made it painfully clear that she had absolutely no intention of stepping aside for Brooke Logan. Meanwhile, Brooke's confidence had only grown stronger thanks to Hope's relentless encouragement. Hope had filled her mother's head with visions of what she supposedly deserved, convincing Brooke that this was finally her time to claim her place beside Ridge at the top of the company. Brooke believed Ridge would fight for her because she had spent the evening reminding him exactly why he always came back to her. She poured on the romance, the seduction, the intimacy, wrapping Ridge in nostalgia and desire until she truly thought she had secured the outcome she wanted. In Brooke's mind, the battle had already been won before Ridge even walked into Steffy's office. But what she failed to understand was that Steffy was no longer willing to quietly tolerate being pushed aside to satisfy someone else's fantasy. For once, Steffy demanded that Ridge choose her over Brooke, and that ultimatum landed like a thunderclap in the middle of the family power struggle. Now, Ridge found himself trapped in the exact nightmare he had hoped to avoid. He had to return home and tell Brooke that Steffy refused to surrender her position, that the plan had failed before it even truly began. And almost embarrassingly, the only thing he had to offer Brooke instead was a dress he designed, like some desperate consolation prize handed over to soften the disappointment. Brooke was never going to accept that quietly. She had invested too much emotionally, romantically, and strategically into this dream. She had truly believed Ridge would fight harder for her, but instead, he barely pushed Steffy at all. Ridge looked exhausted, caught between the two strongest women in his life, unable to fully commit to either side without devastating the other, and the more he hesitated, the more the resentment between Brooke and Steffy threatened to spiral completely out of control. Yet in the middle of all that tension, Steffy actually attempted something surprisingly reasonable. Rather than humiliating Brooke outright, she offered a compromise that could have preserved peace inside the company. Steffy suggested giving Brooke a larger public-facing role as the glamorous representative of Forrester Creations, allowing her to travel, promote the brand, and stand proudly in the spotlight while Steffy continued running the business operations behind the scenes. It was a practical solution, one that acknowledged Brooke's importance without forcing Steffy to surrender the position she had earned. But even as the offer was made, it already felt doomed. Brooke no longer wanted symbolic importance or honorary status. She wanted power. She wanted the title. And behind that growing ambition stood Hope, continuing to fuel the fire with every conversation. Because the deeper truth behind this entire crisis led directly back to Hope Logan. None of this had originally been Brooke's idea. Brooke hadn't been sitting around plotting to overthrow Steffy until Hope planted the thought in her mind and nurtured it into a full-blown campaign. Hope was furious about the fate of Hope for the future, furious about feeling dismissed and sidelined inside a company her family had helped build. And instead of waiting patiently for circumstances to improve, she decided to play politics. She convinced Brooke that Steffy's power needed to be challenged, that Ridge and Brooke belonged together at the top of the company, and that the Logans deserved more respect than they were receiving. Every emotional insecurity Brooke carried became ammunition in Hope's hands, and slowly Brooke transformed from uncertain dreamer into determined challenger. Steffy already suspected Hope's fingerprints were all over this scheme, but once she confirmed it, the fallout promised to become explosive. One could almost picture the confrontation before it even happened. Steffy cornering Hope with fury burning in her eyes while Hope finally stopped pretending innocence and admitted everything. Hope would likely unleash months of bottled frustration, accusing the Forresters of constantly attacking the Logans and refusing to appreciate everything Brooke and Hope had contributed over the years. The argument would become deeply personal, cutting into old wounds that never truly healed between the two families. Hope might even openly declare that Brooke deserved the co-CEO position more than Steffy ever did. And in that heated moment, the tension wouldn't just be about business anymore. It would become a battle over identity, family pride, and years of emotional resentment. Hope's anger had already pushed her dangerously close to obsession. She kept filling Brooke's head with grand declarations about destiny and love, insisting Brooke should be treated like a queen beside Ridge because together they were supposedly fashion's greatest love story. To Steffy, it all felt manipulative and exhausting. No matter where anyone stood in the ongoing Logan versus Forrester war, even Steffy's critics could see that Hope was actively trying to shift the balance of power through emotional pressure and calculated influence. And Steffy, already stretched to her limit, might finally decide enough was enough. There was a very real chance that Hope's latest scheme could push Steffy into firing her all over again. In Steffy's mind, Hope had once again chosen manipulation instead of patience. And now she was threatening to tear the company apart simply because she couldn't accept not getting her way immediately. What made the situation even more dangerous was the possibility that Ridge himself might not stop Steffy this time. If Steffy exposed the truth about Hope being the architect behind Brooke's power play, Ridge could very well decide that Hope had crossed a line. That realization alone could shift everything. And if Hope lost her place at Forrester Creations again, there would still be people waiting to welcome her with open arms. Liam Spencer, Bill Spencer, and Katie Logan would undoubtedly stand behind her if she stormed away from the company in frustration and humiliation. The possibility of Hope leaving Forrester entirely was beginning to feel less like a threat and more like an inevitability hanging over the entire storyline. Still, another possible future loomed just as dangerously over the family. Brooke could refuse to accept defeat and turn toward the one man powerful enough to shift the balance completely: Eric Forrester. If Brooke convinced Eric to support her, then Ridge would have little room left to resist. Together, Eric and Ridge held enough power to force Steffy out of the co-CEO position and hand Brooke exactly what she wanted. And Hope certainly would not stop pushing until every possible avenue had been exhausted. She would encourage Brooke to keep fighting, to refuse to let Steffy win, to make sure the Logans finally secured the authority they believed belonged to them. The war for control inside Forrester Creations would suddenly escalate from emotional conflict into corporate warfare. Ironically, even if Brooke somehow managed to claim Steffy's seat, it still might not solve Hope's real problem. Ridge, Eric, and even Carter Walton would likely remain committed to shelving Hope for the future until Eric's couture collection launched successfully. That reality threatened to crush Hope's expectations entirely. She had seemingly convinced herself that Brooke gaining power would automatically restore her fashion line to prominence, but that might never happen. And if Hope realized her manipulations accomplished nothing, the emotional fallout could be devastating. She could spiral into another furious confrontation, perhaps even choosing to walk away from the company herself rather than remain sidelined and powerless. Then there was the wildest possibility of all, the scenario that almost sounded absurd and yet strangely possible, given Ridge's exhausted state of mind. What if Ridge simply stepped away from the entire war altogether? What if he handed Brooke his own co-CEO position instead of Steffy's and retreated into the creative side of the business where he felt happiest? After all, Ridge had never seemed truly comfortable being trapped between Brooke and Steffy in this endless power struggle. One could almost imagine him escaping into the design room, focusing on sketches and fabrics, while Brooke and Steffy battled endlessly over control of the company. In a twisted way, it might actually be the least stressful option for him. Let the two women face each other directly while he disappeared into the artistic world he loved most. But even that scenario would not guarantee peace. Hope for the future would still remain delayed until Eric's collection launched, and Hope would almost certainly explode with frustration once she realized Brooke's promotion changed nothing for her personally. Worse still, Steffy would retain significant power through ownership shares, meaning she could potentially fire Hope regardless of Brooke's title. Brooke might gain authority, but she still wouldn't truly control the company the way Steffy did, and everyone knew Ridge would never willingly surrender enough ownership to completely overpower his daughter. No matter how the corporate structure shifted, Steffy remained deeply rooted inside the foundation of Forrester Creations itself. As the storm continued building, the future of the company and the fragile relationships holding this family together felt more uncertain than ever. One way or another, Steffy was likely to remain standing in power, whether beside Ridge, beside Brooke, or entirely on her own. Brooke's hunger for recognition had collided headfirst with Steffy's refusal to surrender, while Hope's manipulations had turned simmering tensions into open warfare. And somewhere in the middle of it all stood Ridge, exhausted, emotionally torn, and desperate to avoid destroying the people he loved most. But in the end, it increasingly felt like Hope Logan might be the one who ultimately loses everything. Whether Steffy fires her in anger or Hope storms away after realizing her scheme failed, her future at Forrester Creations now hangs by the thinnest possible thread, and the emotional fallout from this battle is only beginning. The emotional cracks inside Forrester Creations only continued to widen as the pressure surrounding the co-CEO battle became impossible for anyone to ignore. Every hallway conversation, every tense glance across a conference table, every uncomfortable silence between family members carried the weight of a company slowly tearing itself apart from the inside. What made the situation even more painful was the fact that this wasn't just a business disagreement anymore. This was years of resentment, insecurity, rivalry, and wounded pride finally exploding to the surface all at once. Steffy Forrester could feel it everywhere she turned. The loyalty she once believed existed inside her own family suddenly felt uncertain, and that uncertainty hardened her even more. If Brooke and Hope were determined to come after her position, then Steffy was fully prepared to fight back with everything she had. Meanwhile, Brooke Logan was beginning to spiral emotionally after Ridge returned without the victory she expected. The disappointment hit her harder than she wanted to admit, because deep down, she truly believed Ridge would choose her this time. She had convinced herself that their love story still carried enough weight to move mountains, enough to make Ridge stand firmly beside her against anyone, even his own daughter. But instead of triumph, Ridge came home carrying hesitation, guilt, and excuses. Brooke could sense that he had folded under Steffy's pressure almost immediately, and that realization left her humiliated as much as angry. The romantic confidence she carried earlier in the evening slowly transformed into bitterness, and Hope could see it happening in real time. Hope, however, had no intention of allowing Brooke to retreat now. If anything, Ridge's failure only made Hope more determined to push harder. She began feeding Brooke even more aggressively with reassurance, telling her that Steffy was trying to hoard power and silence the Logan women yet again. Hope framed the situation as something bigger than titles or business strategy. To her, this was about respect, about finally forcing the Forresters to acknowledge everything Brooke had sacrificed and everything the Logans had contributed to the company over the years. Hope's words kept reigniting Brooke's anger every time disappointment threatened to cool it down. And the more Hope pushed, the more Brooke started believing that backing down now would mean surrendering her dignity entirely. At the same time, Ridge found himself drowning beneath the consequences of his own indecision. Every path in front of him led toward disaster. If he supported Brooke fully, he risked devastating Steffy and damaging the trust he shared with his daughter. But if he stayed loyal to Steffy, Brooke would see it as yet another betrayal in a long line of emotional disappointments. Ridge looked exhausted by the constant tug of war between the two women who had defined so much of his life. Even when he tried to remain neutral, his silence only fueled the conflict further because both sides interpreted hesitation as weakness. And perhaps for the first time, Ridge began realizing that no compromise would truly satisfy anyone involved. As tensions mounted, Steffy's suspicions toward Hope Logan hardened into near certainty. She replayed every recent interaction in her mind, and suddenly all the pieces started fitting together with alarming clarity. Hope's outrage over hope for the future, Brooke's sudden obsession with becoming co-CEO, the emotional pressure being placed on Ridge. None of it felt random anymore. It felt orchestrated, and the more Steffy thought about it, the angrier she became. In her eyes, Hope wasn't simply frustrated over business decisions. She was actively manipulating family relationships and company dynamics to force outcomes that benefited herself. That realization struck Steffy like a betrayal far deeper than a corporate disagreement. The confrontation that had been building between Steffy and Hope now felt unavoidable. One could almost imagine the atmosphere when it finally happened. The tension crackling through the office as years of buried resentment erupted into the open. Steffy would accuse Hope of using Brooke as a weapon, of poisoning her mother against the Forresters in order to claw back power for herself, and Hope, already emotionally exhausted and furious, would likely stop holding back entirely. She would remind Steffy of every perceived slight, every moment she felt dismissed, judged, or pushed aside by the Forrester family. What began as an argument about executive positions would rapidly spiral into a deeply personal war over identity, family loyalty, and who truly belonged at the center of the company's future. Hope's emotions were becoming increasingly volatile because she genuinely believed she was fighting for justice. In her mind, the Logans had spent years being treated as outsiders despite helping shape the very heart of the company. She saw Steffy as someone abusing power while pretending to protect the business, and that frustration could easily push Hope into saying things she could never take back. She might openly declare that Brooke deserved the company more than Steffy ever would, She might accuse Steffy of constantly attacking Logan women out of insecurity and jealousy, and once words like that were unleashed, there would be no easy path back to peace. But Steffy was no longer in the mood to tolerate emotional manipulation disguised as righteousness. She had spent years protecting Forrester Creations through crises, betrayals, and family chaos, and now she felt Hope was threatening everything again simply because she couldn't accept temporary disappointment. In Steffy's eyes, Hope had been given opportunities, patience, and support, yet the moment things stopped going her way, she reverted to schemes and power plays. That betrayal cut especially deep because Steffy had actually been willing to revisit Hope for the future eventually. She believed the line could have returned after Eric's couture collection finished its launch. But now, because of Hope's interference, Steffy's sympathy was evaporating fast. The looming possibility of Hope being fired again suddenly became terrifyingly real. And this time, the consequences would feel even heavier because it wouldn't just be about poor business performance or creative disagreements. It would be about trust being shattered completely. If Steffy concluded that Hope intentionally manipulated Brooke into destabilizing the company hierarchy, she might see termination as the only way to stop the chaos from spreading further. What made the situation even more dangerous was the possibility that Ridge might quietly allow it to happen. He may not openly support firing Hope, but if he realized she orchestrated this entire conflict behind the scenes, he could decide not to stand in Steffy's way. That silence alone would devastate Brooke and Hope more than almost anything else. And still, the shadow of Eric Forrester lingered over every conversation like a final, unpredictable card waiting to be played. Brooke knew Eric held enormous influence, and Hope would undoubtedly push her mother toward him next. If Eric sided with Brooke, the balance of power inside Forrester Creations could change overnight. Suddenly, Steffy's position would no longer feel untouchable. Brooke could finally gain the authority she craved, and Hope would see it as validation that her strategy worked. Yet even in that scenario, victory might prove hollow. The company leadership could shift, but the underlying resentment between the Forresters and Logans would only deepen into something far uglier and more permanent. Ironically, even if Brooke secured the co-CEO role, Hope still might not get the outcome she desperately wanted. Carter Walton, Ridge, and Eric would likely continue prioritizing the couture line before reopening Hope for the future. That possibility threatened to unravel Hope emotionally because she had built so much expectation around Brooke gaining power. She imagined everything changing overnight once Brooke sat beside Ridge at the top of the company. But reality could hit far harder than she anticipated. Brooke might gain a title while Hope remained sidelined, frustrated, and powerless. And that crushing realization could finally push Hope toward an emotional breaking point. Even Ridge's potential escape plan, stepping away from leadership entirely and returning to design work, carried its own emotional sadness. There was something almost tragic about the idea of Ridge retreating from the battlefield because the war between Brooke and Steffy had become too painful to survive. It painted the picture of a man exhausted by decades of emotional conflict, someone desperate to hide inside creativity because he no longer knew how to fix the people he loved. One could almost picture him alone in the design room, sketching gowns in silence, while chaos raged around him elsewhere in the building. In some ways, it would feel like surrender. Not to Brooke or Steffy specifically, but to the endless cycle of emotional destruction that always seemed to follow this family. And through it all, one haunting truth continued hanging over the entire situation. No matter which executive title changed hands, no matter who won the latest power struggle, the emotional damage inside this family was becoming irreversible. Trust was eroding. Loyalties were shifting. Relationships built over decades were straining beneath the weight of ambition and resentment. The Forresters and Logans were no longer simply competing for influence inside a fashion empire. They were fighting for validation, legacy, and emotional survival. And as the storm inside Forrester Creations kept building toward its inevitable explosion, it became painfully clear that when the dust finally settled, someone was going to walk away shattered.